Hello everyone, and thank you for choosing NG Preparation to study for your economics course. Now, this lesson begins with studying the foundations of economics at an IB level. And now in my experience with working with IB students in the past, the biggest complaints that I hear are about the level of difficulty of conceptual understanding required for the course, the level of memorization needed. And of course, this might result in anxieties related to your course. However, I do honestly believe that with the necessary time dedicated to the course, everybody will be able to achieve a level 7 in economics, and this is what this series of economics videos on NG Preparation aims to achieve. So without further ado, let's start looking at the beginnings of economics as given by the IB syllabus. So the first thing that the IB syllabus specifies that its students must understand is that economics is a social science. Now, what is social science? Social science is just a branch of science that deals with interactions and relationships between people and between human societies. So the social scientific method begins with identifying a problem. So in economics, we begin by identifying a problem that is relevant to the field of economics. Once we've identified a problem, we can begin by gathering data about the issue. And then we can, referring back to the data, create a logical hypothesis that can arguably explain the data. And then, of course, once we have a hypothesis, we test our hypothesis. And the last continuous stage of the social scientific method is basically an allowance for the introduction of new evidence, change, or that can possibly our hypothesis. You'll often find that in economics that models are not the most realistic. And the reason for this is that there are often too many factors to be considered at one given moment to create a realistic model, which is why we often have the assumption of ceteris paribus. Ceteris paribus is Latin for all things remaining equal. So for instance, if we were trying to predict how an increase in price of Coca-Cola will affect its substitute good, Pepsi, then we would have to assume that the only thing that's going to change is the price of Coca-Cola, because obviously if the cost of production of Pepsi change, if taste and preferences for Pepsi change at the same time that price of Coca-Cola changes, then that will also affect quantity demanded of Pepsi. And then we can form a prediction or an explanation as to why there has been a quantity demanded change in its substitute good, Pepsi. And the next part of the syllabus point asks us to distinguish between normative economics and positive economics. So you might have come across the term normative and positive before. Normative really just means that there's some sort of value judgment attached to it. So for instance, if I say that income inequality is unfair, then that is a normative judgment. Whereas with a positive statement, so for instance, income inequality has increased over the past few years in the US, that would be a positive statement that can actually be factually verified through quantitative evidence. When we talk about normative and positive economics often deals with the ideas of fairness. So for instance, should income inequality be handled through government intervention? Now the next syllabus point looks at the idea of rationality. So we assume that consumers and firms will act rationally and that they will undergo cost-benefit analysis whenever making a decision. So for instance, in general, we assume that consumers are utility maximizing. So utility maximizing is basically a phrase that just means that consumers will always decide to spend their money in a way that will make their utility or the benefits that they get from products as high as possible. Whereas producers are profit maximizing, which again, kind of self-explanatory, just means that producers will attempt to maximize their profit or to get as much profit as possible whenever they make decisions. So this is a very simplified version of how society works, but again, because there are so many complex factors, economists often just rely on these two assumptions that consumers will always act rationally and buy products that offer them the most utility, the most benefit, and producers are really only fueled by profit maximizing goals. Okay, so now we kind of looked at economics in terms of a social science, but then let's now look at the main assumptions that guide economics as a study. So scarcity is one of the key concepts in economics, and scarcity simply means that factors of production are finite, people's wants are infinite, meaning that whereas there is only so much labor in the world needed to produce certain goods, the want for these goods are never ending. And what this results in is the need to make a choice, a decision. So economists have to decide how to allocate their resources, how to use their factors of production even though they're finite, in order to meet as many wants as possible. So this problem of scarcity and the need to make a decision results in three basic economic questions. The first one is how to produce. So what factors of production do we use in the production of certain goods? And you will see that this question of how to produce is related to productive efficiency. So it makes sense that if we assume that firms are profit maximizing entities, then they will want to minimize their cost of production as much as possible. Or in other words, they want to produce at productive efficiency. So productive efficiency is when average costs are at their minimum. But this isn't always the case, and we will find that later. The second question is what to produce. So since we're running out of factors of production and wants are infinite, then how do we decide what goods and services to provide if there are so many goods and services that are being demanded relative to our factors of production? So the question of what to produce is a difficult one, but we will often see that the best answer to the question of what to produce is related to allocative efficiency, the optimum combination of goods and services. And what to produce is also guided by the price mechanism. So as we know, consumers are utility maximizing. Then we would also assume that they would be willing to pay more money for things that they derive more utility or more benefit out of. So we see that price serves a sort of signaling function. It signals producers what consumers are willing to spend money on, and therefore it helps us answer the what to produce question in a free market economy. And now the third question is for whom to produce. So if there are so many different people demanding different things, then how do we choose who to give our products to? Now, again, this relates to the price mechanism. So we say that price and money serves as a rationing mechanism, meaning that it will push out consumers that are not able to pay the price that producers are appointing to a certain product. Now we kind of begin to see that the answers to the questions might seem quite unfair, or that they might result in unfair income distribution. And this is where normative economics comes in. So sometimes normative economics tries to understand how we can limit income inequality and to make sure that low income groups are protected, for instance. So even though in a free market economy, the questions of how to produce, what to produce, and who to produce would often be determined by market forces, by supply and demand, by price mechanisms, there are situations where in command economy, so in government-controlled economies, that all of these questions are answered by the government. So how to produce is answered by the government, not by firms. What to produce is answered by the government, and who to produce for is also governed by the government. However, in reality, most economies nowadays are a mix of market-based and command economy. So they have a mix of market forces and also government intervention. So as you know, economics often deals with diagrams. So how can we show all of these concepts of scarcity and decision-making in terms of a diagram? So you might have come across the PPC, so the production possibilities curve. The production possibilities curve is graphed by one good on the x-axis and one good on the y-axis. In the production possibilities curve, we assume that the level of technology in an economy is constant. We assume a fixed amount of factors of production, and we assume full employment level of resources. So if an economy is producing on the line of the PPC, then it is fully employing all of its resources. But of course, naturally, a lot of economies, or all economies, have some level of unemployment or unemployed resources. So realistically, most economies would be producing within the PPC curve. And if you see within the PPC curve, there is a loss of opportunity, because we could technically be producing more of good X or more of good Y without foregoing any more of good X or good Y, right? But the reason that PPC helps us understand choice is because the curve is downward sloping, meaning that if I want to produce more of good X, so let's say initially I'm producing this much good X and this much good Y, then let's say I want to produce more of good Y. If I want to produce more of good Y, then I immediately have to produce less of good X, right? So less of good X. And obviously this shows that a decision has to be made. If I want to produce more of good X, I have to produce less of good Y because I only have so many factors of production. So this is how the PPC reflects choice and how it reflects scarcity. The PPC also reflects opportunity cost. So if choices must be made in economics and every choice that I make results in me foregoing something of something else, then that results in an opportunity cost. So like we said in the PPC curve, if I produce more of good X, then I immediately have to produce less of good Y because I have a limited amount of factors of production. So for instance, in this example, I choose to produce 5 more units of good X, but therefore I have to sacrifice 10 more units of good Y. The opportunity cost can therefore be calculated as change in Y over change in X, so 10 over 5 gives us 2, meaning that for every additional unit of X that I produce, I'm foregoing 2 units of Y. So in that sense, opportunity cost is just change in Y over change in X, which is the same as the slope. So actually, the production possibilities curve slope is the opportunity cost. So we've successfully just covered every syllabus point under the foundations of economics, and we will be returning to the concepts of opportunity cost, production possibility curves, fairness, normative economics in the upcoming videos, so please stay tuned.